And today I'm going to be talking about ADHD Whirled, and by that I mean all the whirling confluence of forces which are contributing to make a world that I would say is ADHD-ogenic, or that, in other words, is contributing to making ADHD more prevalent in our world and more severe in those individuals who have it. So a good chunk of this is in my book, Recognizing Adult ADHD. It's available on Amazon and other places. I'll be talking for about 20 minutes today, and we'll be open to questions that you can type in while I'm talking. Again, we're in the process of moving these talks also to YouTube, so they won't just be on Facebook. And apologize, wildfire smoke in California is still pretty bad, actually worse today than the last several days, so I may need to interrupt this at several times to drink some water. So the other thing about this talk is most of the other talks I've made, I have tried to be as factual as possible and to make it clear what are direct observations, what are inescapable conclusions from that. I will readily acknowledge today that a good part of what I'm saying are my conjectures, my theories, my beliefs. I think they're well supported by data, but a certain element of it is conjectural or hypothetical and testable too. So when we talk about ADHD, we've talked, and you may know from other sources, that ADHD is highly heritable. If parents have it, kids are likely to have it, often, particularly in the 90s when we were just learning about it in adults. Often the way adults came to our attention is because their kids were at a clinic being treated for ADHD, and the doctor started noticing, hey, these parents seem to have those traits as well. So there's a measure of heritability, which is, and the heritability of ADHD is 0.8, with the highest heritability you could achieve is a 1. Now the heritability some people misinterpret as the percentage of contribution of genetics to their own individual ADHD-ness, and heritability is actually a much more complicated term, meaning the percentage of variation in that trait across the population that's due to genetic causes rather than to the environment or to chance. But a 0.8 is high. It's at least as high as it is for schizophrenia. It's actually a little higher than most studies suggest for depression or anxiety disorders. So we know that there's a huge, robust genetic component to ADHD, but we also know that that's not the whole story. We know that with identical twins, it's not that unusual for one twin to have ADHD and the other to not meet the criteria. So there are absolutely, certainly non-genetic factors which can contribute to ADHD. Now, some people have been alarmed over the years that when we find different rates of ADHD in different cultures and different societies, or at different times within a society, that proves ADHD can't be a real condition. If it's changing over time, they say, that means it can't have any biological basis. It's just a social artifact, a social construction. And while I absolutely would agree that all of our diseases, both medical and psychiatric, or subset of medical that is psychiatric, do have a part of it is a social construction. I'd argue, one, that it's a useful social construction, but that doesn't mean there is not an absence of biological underpinnings between it. Again, it just means that all the variability is there. So for a long time, the ADHD field has been very defensive, though, that if we find differences in frequency of ADHD in different populations, then it must be that they're not measuring it accurately at different places, or they're not looking for it, or they're interpreting as something else, without accepting the real possibility that ADHD may really be present at different rates in different populations and change over time. And again, the arguments I'm making today are that we should expect to see ADHD increasing because we are making an ADHD-ogenic environment. We are creating an environment which is increasing pressures for all of our brains to be a little more ADHD-like, and that means more individuals will be crossing the threshold between not having it and having it, or a subsyndromal state and a full-blown ADHD state. And some of this ties into the concept of neuroplasticity. So even though we have, again, strong genetic contributions, we know that experiences that people undergo, particularly in early life, but even later in life, shape how our nervous system gets wired, shape which connections get strongly made, which connections fade away with time, how our brain is actually wired. I'm not saying it's completely flexible or plastic or mutable, but it's not impervious to societal influences. So getting back to the concept that if it shows different rates in different areas, it's not a real disease. I mean, we know that that's just hogwash, looking at things like lung cancer. Lung cancer varies incredibly at different places across the earth. It differs between men and women, the rates of it. Some of that is due to individual choice, with cigarette smoking being the biggest factor. But we also know that ambient background levels of air pollution, higher in different areas, correlate with higher chance of developing a very clearly biological disease of lung cancer. We also see this within psychiatry. We know, and PTSD would probably be the clearest and best example where we openly acknowledge and know there is a clear societal, external to the person's genes and biology factor which contributes to them developing PTSD or not developing PTSD. This doesn't mean everyone in a war zone develops it or everyone exposed to the trauma does, but it means exposure to trauma is an essential component of it. In areas with more rampant, severe, life-threatening traumas, you are seeing higher rates of PTSD. And we know this extends to other psychiatric conditions. So there's, from the very first days of the COVID pandemic and the shutdown, people were saying, oh, we're going to see increases in depression. We're going to see increases in anxiety as people spend more months in this COVID state. So I'm a little puzzled why we sort of insist that things like PTSD, depression, and anxiety should respond to social patterns, should respond to stressors or changes in the environment, and yet the ADHD field seems rather adamantly opposed to believing that there could be real changes in frequency and that those changes may be increasing over time because the condition itself is really becoming more prevalent. So what are these forces that I keep saying are present and are pushing our world in a more ADHD direction? So again, what I'm arguing is that there's several different factors and that these factors both produce more ADHD-like symptoms. So they either decrease attentiveness, they increase impulsivity, they may increase hyperactivity, they create a more ADHD-like person. And with most of these symptoms or factors, we know that someone with ADHD is more likely to display or someone who already has ADHD behavior is more likely to engage in these other behaviors, which again contribute to ADHD, making a big feedback loop. So I might not have worded that very clearly, so I'll jump to a more specific example with sleep. We know with sleep deprivation has immediate, profound effects on attention, on concentration, on impulsivity, on decision-making, on ability to plan, on ability to use your information. So deficits in sleep problems create an ADHD-like picture. And that is a causative role. It's not just a correlation. On the other hand, we also know that people who already have ADHD, who are diagnosed with ADHD, have worse sleep patterns. They are less regular with their sleep time. They go to bed later. They have fewer hours fully in sleep. So I'm arguing it's just one example of a feedback loop. Sleep problems cause ADHD. ADHD causes more sleep problems. And we know at a societal level, whether or not you may be one of the and I will label it good and virtuous ones, who really is not just sleeping 8 hours, but as we talked before, sleeping the same 8 hours every night, weekday, week out, and which is the healthy way to sleep. We know, that the most recent statistics in America are that 3/4 of people between the ages of 25 to 55 are sleeping less than 8 hours. So at a population level, we are sleeping less, and we would expect more ADHD symptoms to result from that. And I would argue those who may have a stronger genetic propensity and who are more prone to it, that chronic sleep deprivation, separate from just acute sleep deprivation, may be pushing some of those most vulnerable individuals into an ADHD full-blown, full diagnostic state. This is not just a metaphor. This is not just, so sleep is one example of that feedback loop. I would argue exercise is another. We know that people deprived of exercise have more problems concentrating, more problems sitting down and doing sustained mental activity, are more restless. We know that children with ADHD have higher tendency to be sedentary, to be maybe hyper-focused on their video games or toys, or not engaging, or picking up an exercise regimen and vigorously pursuing it for a few weeks and then not continuing with it in the long run. So with exercise, again, I would argue, and overall looking at exercise levels, whether it's just steps walked or more rigorous measures of cardiovascular fitness, Americans have become less fit over the last century. So as exercise decreases, as physical fitness decreases, we are encouraging producing more ADHD symptoms in our population. And as individuals have more ADHD symptoms present, they are more prone to doing less exercise. So again, that is a feedback loop. Less exercise, more ADHD, less exercise. And again, I'm arguing this is a loop that's happening both at the individual level and the whole population level. What are some of these other feedback loops? So one of the others is a food and diet, and I know there's a fair amount of controversy and opinions and some data on the food-diet connections, but there's some small and growing evidence that in terms of food contributing to ADHD, that babies with particularly low omega-3 levels in their blood are more prone to developing a range of ADHD symptoms later in life. There's some small evidence that particularly food dyes and food colorings, and maybe some other additives early in life, that your overall exposure to that or dosage of that correlates with higher rates of developing ADHD. And again, so that's the first half of the cycle. Bad diets or non-traditional diets or modern diets or junk food diets, whatever you want to call them, may well seem to correlate or contribute to our precursors of having more ADHD. But on the other hand, we've also studied the other half of the loop, that we know that children with ADHD, adults with ADHD, have less nutritious diets, have less regular eating habits, have more junk food in their bodies. So I'm saying that's a feedback loop that's feeding itself. Poorer diet, more ADHD, poorer diet, more ADHD. And again, there are certainly many individuals in our society who strenuously adhere to good, healthy diets, but as a population, this is a true statement, and some of it's even separate from individual choice. There's extensive work that our modern agricultural practices, separate from whether they're just encouraging us to eat more meat and unhealthy food, but even on the vegetable, fruit sources, the plant sources of our diet, there seems to be less nutrients per pound of that type of food that we are eating. We have sort of bred for good looks, we've bred for hardiness, we've bred for pesticide resistance, we've bred for resistance to insects and other pests in the environment, and we have not bred in general, or pretty much at all, for nutritional density in our food. So if people are even eating the same amount of strawberries now and apples as they did 100 years ago, they're not getting the same amount of nutrients in there. So that's the food diet feedback loop. There's also a nature exposure to nature loop. That there are several studies looking at kids who take a walk for an hour in a green park have better concentration, better focus, less irritability, less impulsivity than kids who have a similar amount of exercise in a non-green area. And we also know that, particularly kids who are, again, more glued to their screens, more glued to their indoor environment are getting out less. So kids with ADHD in general, it's certainly not every kid, are getting less exposure to nature. So that's another feedback loop. So one of the things you'll probably have noticed by now, none of these feedback loops exist in isolation. If you're eating more poorly, that may affect your physical activity as well. If you're overweight, it's harder to exercise. If you're deprived of sleep, you're more tired and maybe not willing to exercise. And then the big loop that I haven't gotten to yet, and I'm going to blur what I think are probably two separate loops. One is what I'd call a screen time video loop, and it's sort of the antithesis of the nature exposure loop. And the other is the social information, social media, our whole information society, how we're bombarded. I'm going to sort of mush them together right now, but there's a fair and growing body of evidence that kids who spend more time in front of screens, more time on video devices, less time interacting with people, turn out being, one, both more sedentary, more obese, have poorer diets, poorer sleep habits, but also a broader range and more severe ADHD symptoms, more distractibility, shorter attention spans, more impulsivity. And we also have growing evidence that kids with ADHD, clearly diagnosed ADHD, if you compare what they're doing with their time, they are spending more time on Facebook, more time on screens, more time engaged in video games, more immersion in this world. And it may be because there are less social stigma to doing it. It may be other aspects of the wiring of their brain, but we can see both halves of this loop in action. And again, I'd say they are making our whole environment more ADHD-like day by day. It's as if we're doing a vast experiment where we are culturally appropriating the ADHD subculture or environment without asking, without testing, without knowing what results this is going to have on our society. And I'll bring in as a final minute or two the sort of subset of the Donald Trump piece of it. So Donald Trump is actually completely unimaginable as a US president in a non-ADHD-like world, in a non-attention deficit world. One of the most famous speeches in American history is the Gettysburg Address. It's just a few minutes long. And Abraham Lincoln was widely derided at the time because the other speakers at that same gathering in Gettysburg spoke, or the main speaker spoke for more than an hour. His speech was thrown off as, this is a trivial quip. I mean, if Donald Trump would try without a teleprompter to say anything even half as long as the Gettysburg Address, his audience wouldn't sit still for it. So again, Trump himself is only possible, it's only conceivable in an ADHD world, in a world where he throws off 100 quips a day and we're not worried about the context, we're not tracking down the veracity of each statement, but I argue he is pushing our whole world in a more ADHD direction because he's making 40 tweets a day, and if you support him or if you dislike him, you are driven to respond immediately and driven to respond without context and driven to respond on the basis of emotions and appearances rather than on deep thought or explanation, partly because he's going to make another comment in 20 or 30 more minutes that you also have to respond to. And his cadre of adherents or detractors is going to be responding, and if you don't respond quickly enough, there's pressure to feel left out. So again, I'm claiming there's a host of factors that are driving our world to be more ADHD-like, and we need to be looking at that more closely and asking ourselves, is this really how we want to be training our brains, shaping our brains, adjusting the neuroplasticity to be more like individuals with full-blown ADHD, with the recognition that if we are doing so, more of us will actually meet full diagnostic criteria for ADHD. So at the 20-minute mark, I'm going to stop now. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Again, some of this is in my book. Some of it's also in Medium posts under Dr. John Cruz. Next week, I am planning on talking about ADHD and neuroatypicalness and where this fits in with the whole concept of neuroatypicalness and the whole concept of, is ADHD a disease? It's a condition. Is it a difference? What is it? And I'm not going to pretend there's a definitive answer to that one. So I'm not seeing any questions right now. Again, this post will be on Facebook Live and we'll be getting it up on YouTube in the near future. So be safe, have a good week, avoid the smoke and other toxins in the environment, political or otherwise, and I'll see you next Friday.